Director of Events for the Center for Climate Literacy at the University of Minnesota, but I work at the University of Illinois, where I'm an assistant professor of sustainability education in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership. It is my pleasure to introduce you all today to my colleague, who is just a couple of offices down the hallway from me right now, Dr. Stephanie Toliver. Dr. Toliver is an assistant professor of curriculum and instruction with a focus in English education and adolescent and secondary literacy. In her research, Toliver employs creativity and imagination as tools to confront systemic inequities and promote more equitable education environments. Specifically, Stephanie's scholarship focuses on three main areas. One, investigating Black storytelling as a mechanism of social critique and transformation. Two, examining the applicability of speculative fiction, such as science fiction, horror, and fantasy, as a tool to assist Black youth in articulating and challenging social injustice. And three, exploring the use of creative and arts-based literacy pedagogies to help pre-service English teachers develop strategies to address racial injustice in their future classrooms. She is the author of the award-winning book, Recovering Black Storytelling in Qualitative Research, Endarkened Storywork, and her academic work has been published in several journals, including Equity, Excellence in Education, the Journal of Literacy Research, and the Teachers College Record. Her public scholarship has been featured in the Chicago Tribune, Ms. Magazine, and Visible Magazine. And today, Dr. Toliver her talk today will examine how speculative fiction can address climate change and social inequality as a way to challenge all of us to envision bold, just, and sustainable futures. Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. We are thrilled to have you here, and you should be able to share your slides now. Thank you.
Let's see. Can I get a thumbs up if y'all can see the title slide here? Thank you. All right. So, hi, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. While we can't be together in person, at least not in person. Sam is down in the halls, but other people not in person. I do hope that we can connect over a topic that I think is both urgent and deeply personal, and it's the ways in which climate change intersects with inequality. And I say deeply personal because I am from a space that is that has been systemically economically disadvantaged to the point where there has been some questions about the ways that the climate environment has impacted the health of the folks who live there. And so this is something that I deeply care about because it's home. And so one of the things that I was thinking about with this talk is, how are we as individuals and as a society really grappling with a world that is changing, sometimes too quickly for us to even keep up, and other times in ways that we don't even see? And I've also been thinking about, like, what role does fiction, and particularly science fiction and climate fiction, play in helping us imagine a different kind of a world that is more just, more equitable, and potentially more resilient. And so I often, not now, but a while ago, I often thought of climate change as this abstract, distant crisis. But the reality is that it's already here, and its effects are deeply felt by people who are the most vulnerable. And whether that's through rising sea levels, extreme weather events, or even economic instability, we're seeing a world that is slowly shifting, sometimes violently, sometimes quietly. And while many of us have the privilege to ignore or adapt to these changes, others are left without the resources to survive. But I think in order to understand how we got here and to think about how we might move forward, we really need to look into how speculative fiction might help us imagine a world that works differently. Some of you may be familiar with this genre, but if not, by the end of this 35-ish minutes, I hope you'll have a better understanding of how it helps us to think through our common and interconnected struggles, and also how it might help us think about futures in radically different ways. So today I want to start with a quote that I think sets the tone for the conversation that I want to have. And it's from the writer and scholar Samuel Delany, who says that science fiction isn't just thinking about the world out there. It's also thinking about how the world might be, which is a particularly important exercise for those who are oppressed, because if we're going to change the world we live in, they and all of us have to be able to think about a world that works differently. So you might be wondering, like, why focus on science fiction? Like, why not just look at data or reports from climate scientists? And I think that in some ways, science fiction does what facts alone can't. It helps us to think beyond the present, to visualize futures we might not otherwise consider. And for marginalized people, especially, this imaginative exercise is crucial. Like, if we're going to challenge the systems that are failing us, systems of power, race, class, inequality, we first need to be able to picture a world that works better for everybody. And so, as I dig into Cli-Fi today, I really want us to think about this question: what would it take to create a world that is both just and sustainable? Not just in an abstract or utopian sense, but in the messy, complex, and often painful realities that writers like Octavia Butler and Sherri L. Smith, who I'm going to talk about today, present in their works. These writers show us that the future won't be simply determined by what happens to the climate. It will also depend on who has the power to shape the narrative of survival and who gets left behind. And so again, I want you to keep that question in mind. What would it take to create a world that is both just and sustainable? So before I dive into the text, I do want to introduce the term cli-fi just in case, short for climate fiction. You may have heard the term recently, like it's been in movies everywhere. It's become a lot more popular as the impacts of climate change are becoming more impossible to ignore. So Cli-fi, like most science fiction, it's a form of fiction literature that features some alteration that modifies or extends something from our everyday reality. The main thing that Cli-fi deals with, though, is this difference that is modified is the climate. So it's rooted in science fiction, but it also draws on realism, the supernatural. And the term cli-fi, it became popular around the 2010s, but people have been writing cli-fi, perhaps unintentionally, for at least like a couple centuries. Like Darkness by Lord Byron, written in 1816, is an example to me of cli-fi. And so I think that like it seems like it's new, but it's not. Like we have been wondering about the earth around us for centuries, and we've been writing about that for centuries. And so it's something to really consider. And so although like there's not a definite like this is what has to be in a cli-fi story, but there are some typical elements that are usually there. So it's going to usually have accelerated pacing that's punctuated by some type of crisis. It's going to have an anxious and fearful mood. The setting is going to undergo dramatic transformations like throughout. And then the plot is really going to center around more emotional arcs of the characters. So climate change is a deep-rooted systemic problem that can't be solved by a single protagonist in a story. And so a lot of times the drama is going to revolve around emotions. You will have like a protagonist sometimes, but there's also going to be like how they're interacting with people, how they're interacting with the environment. So the characters are broader, so we can kind of look into the ways that people might come together or how they're feeling about being in this space. Um, but I think what's really important for me with this kind of general, here are some things that are in cli-fi, is the fact that cli-fi isn't just about natural disasters or rising temperatures. It's about exploring these deeper consequences of ecological collapse. And most importantly, who gets left behind when that world starts to shift. So at its core, cli-fi asks some critical questions. Who survives and who doesn't in a changing world? It's a genre that examines how climate change intersects with race, gender, class, power, how the most vulnerable communities, those with the least access to resources, are the ones who often bear the brunt of environmental disasters. But cli-fi isn't all about doom and gloom. Like there is a lot of doom and gloom. I will not lie and say that it is a happy genre, but it also offers us a glimpse into futures of cooperation, futures of justice, futures of perseverance. And so, why is cli-fi relevant now? I mean, simply put, it's mirroring and reflecting the world around us. But it's also challenging us to think critically about what could be. It's a genre that it doesn't let us just imagine our own survival, but it forces us to ask like how we can thrive together in a more equitable world. And so while there are many texts that fall under this genre, I put some of the movies that I like up on the screen that fall within the genre, but also some books because I am a literacy scholar who also likes the reading and writing part. But the ones that I want to focus on today are two books written by Black women authors, and they were both set in the 2020s, so very much in our current time. And so the first is Orleans by Sherri Smith, and the second is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And so I want to jump into this first text, which I'm going to start with Orleans, because I think that Sherri Smith is the lesser known author out of the two. And so Orleans is set in this post-climate collapsed world. And what's striking is that the environmental devastation isn't just like an isolated event, it's kind of woven into the social breakdown that follows in the rest of the story. And so it starts with a storm. And this is like on the first like pre-pages of the novel, and I took some screenshots of it. So it starts with, after the storm deaths came other casualties, deaths by debris, cuts, tetanus, or loss of blood, suicide, heart attacks caused by stress of loss or stress of rebuilding, or just as often from the lack of medicines used to treat common ailments. The list of no longer treatable diseases grew: diabetes, asthma, cancer. Domestic violence rose along with murder. Then came the fever and the quarantine. So in this passage, Smith gives us this chilling portrait of the aftermath, right? It's not just about the immediate physical damage of this storm, the debris, the injuries, the infections, but it's also about this psychological and social toll. You have heart attacks, the exhaustion that comes with rebuilding, the collapse of public health systems. And what's especially haunting is how the list of diseases that can no longer be treated grows. And these are diseases that we treat now, like asthma, diabetes, things that we have already, quote unquote, solved. And so what she's trying to show us here is that climate change doesn't just alter the environment, it breaks down the very systems we rely on for survival. And here it's clear who suffers most: those who already have the least. So I think about it in this way, like in a world where basic needs are increasingly hard to meet, who is the most vulnerable? Like, is it the wealthy who can afford to relocate, or the poor who have nowhere to go? And so in this next part, we see this formal response from the government, and how they frame this crisis through a formal quarantine. It says like the borders are sealed off, restricting movement, limiting access to safety. But what's especially revealing to me is how the government justifies this action as a necessary step to protect the population at large. So on the surface, this might sound like a rational response, right? But when we dig deeper, it exposes some really uncomfortable truths about how crises are managed. So in here, you can see how the government emphasizes this fear of contagion. Like we don't want this to get out, right? And so they present this quarantine kind of like as a controlling of the spread of disease. Yet there's something really chilling in their statement about making progress towards treatment, only after the disease has run its course. Like it's like, we're going to let this run its course first. So what it suggests is that the government's plan doesn't include the people that are infected, particularly those in the South. Delta fever, which is the thing that's happening here, as it's portrayed in the novel, is already fatal at this point in the story. So, and this is the beginning of the story. So the implication of letting this disease run its course is basically like, we're going to let the people who are most affected die, and then we'll go and try to fix things afterwards. And it kind of, to me, like I have pictures from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina up here because it drew some really disturbing parallels to the real world, where crises like climate disasters, pandemics often expose the inequalities in how we treat different people. The government's rhetoric about protecting the population at large is like this thin veil for the brutality or the brutal reality that when it comes down to it, certain people are deemed expendable. And so this quarantine that they declare is not just about managing public health, it's about control over who lives, who dies, who's allowed to survive. And in the novel, as in our world, policies implemented in the name of protection often reveal these deeper issues of inequality and exclusion. But I want to share this final excerpt, and this is still from the beginning because I thought it was really important to highlight how she's kind of setting this up. But this final excerpt presents an official declaration that mirrors something that we've kind of seen in history, the political abandonment of certain regions or populations, particularly in times of crisis. And I'm going to read this excerpt from the Declaration of Separation. And it says, courtesy of the Smithsonian Collection, March 11th, 2025. Therefore, it is with great regret and pain for our fellow citizens that the United States Senate has agreed to withdraw our governance of the affected states of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The shape of our great nation has been altered irrevocably by nature, and now man must follow suit in order to protect the inalienable rights of the majority, those being the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The foremost of those being life. Signed this day, the 11th of March, 2025, in the presence of witnesses, the President of the United States, and lots of governors from the states that are being formally withdrawn. And so this formal withdrawal of governance from 5 states kind of shows how in this world, the government has chosen to prioritize the majority, or those considered the safe citizens, over those who are most affected by the crisis. And so this isn't just environmental collapse, it's a political one as well. This declaration of separation in Orleans draws on the language of the Declaration of Independence, prompting us to think about this moment in relation to America's long, troubled history with respecting the inalienable rights of all its citizens. In this fictional future that Smith is showing us, the government claims it's acting to protect the rights of people, but in doing so, it chooses to alienate and abandon entire groups of people who are the most vulnerable, those who are already marginalized due to race, class, and geography. And even the formal tone of remorse in this declaration hides a different reality. The government's decision to let this Delta fever run its course, like I said, it's disingenuous. Like by allowing the disease to ravage these affected populations without intervention, the government is basically sentencing the citizens to death. And it's not about a lack of resources, it's about the deliberate choice not to intervene. And so this act of abandonment kind of is like a form of reverse secession, where they're like, okay, well, instead of seceding from the union, the government's going to secede from its responsibility to protect its own citizens. And so this withdrawal of governments it's not a natural consequence of environmental collapse from this storm that kind of affects this place, but it's a calculated decision to prioritize the rights and the safety of the privileged while leaving the marginalized to fend for themselves. And so the government's actions here highlights a truth that in times of crisis, a lot of times those with the least power and the fewest resources, which are often the poor, the sick, people of color, are the first to be left behind. And so she sets this up in a way that kind of lets us know, like, here is the basis, here's the foundation for this future, where it's something that doesn't seem like it's far off, right? It's something that seems like, oh yeah, this could be plausible. This could be something that the government chooses to do, because instead of spending resources to help the people that need it, it's like, we're just going to protect the ones that aren't sick, that aren't affected by this climate disaster, and we're just going to cut y'all off. Y'all aren't going to be part of the United States anymore. And so she's kind of setting this up for us. And so I want to kind of pause here and acknowledge that the excerpts that we've just discussed from Orleans are tough, heavy, and honestly, like, pretty terrifying. The Declaration of Separation was signed according to the text on March 11th, 2025. That's next week. But what I want you to remember is that this is just the beginning of the story. These are the first pages, and there's much more to explore. And I'm not going to be able to go through the whole story, even though I would love to talk to anyone about this story because I read it years and years ago, and it's not a big, well-known story. But I want to encourage you to read the work and to see the intricate ways that she weaves this tale of race, class, gender, and climate change into this dystopian narrative that feels all too possible. But I really, really wanted to point out that this is next week that this thing was signed, because if we're speaking about events of things that might be possible, I think we have to talk about not just this kind of beginning opening space, but I think I want to bring in Parable of the Sower now to kind of show you another example of possibility. I do think like the introduction of Orleans kind of sets up a good scene for us to think about how we might get there. And there's a lot in that story that I cannot cover, but Parable of the Sower, I think, provides another look into this possible world. So speaking of events that might be possible, Parable of the Sower begins on July 20th, 2024. So that was 229 days ago. So while you may not know Sherri Smith, you probably know Octavia Butler. I feel like her name has been everywhere in recent years, especially because in her book, Parable of the Talents, which is the next book in the Parable series, is where like she kind of coined the term "Make America Great Again," and so that has been coming up a lot more recently. But Octavia was one of the first Black women to make an indelible mark on science fiction. And so in her work, especially in Parable of the Sower, she looks at the deep consequences of human action or inaction when it comes to climate collapse. So she challenges us to kind of reflect on how environmental destruction intersects with systemic inequities, particularly along the lines of race, class, and social status. So in the novel, she kind of paints this haunting picture of how the most vulnerable members of society, particularly the homeless, are hit hardest by climate crisis. And so she says, like, due to their lack of resources, money for food, water, shelter, they are at severe risk of malnutrition and injury. As Lauren Olamina, who is the protagonist, observes, she says, a lot of folks who are out, she's like walking after her community is, what's the word I want to say? After it is attacked. She is forced to kind of go on the run, and she's walking around and she's noticing that there are people all around her who also have no places to go. And she notices that these people, they are malnourished. They don't have anywhere to go. Like they're just wandering in this space. They don't have spaces for shelter. They suffer from these festering wounds. And when this extreme weather hits, so in this space, like there's fires everywhere and it's set in California. And so it's like way too close to home for me, but it's set in California. There's all these fires that are ravaging the spaces and there's nowhere for these people to go. And they're already living on the fringes of society. And they're the first to feel these devastating effects of a climate change world. And her portrayal of homeless folks is devastating, but it's grounded in these real world dynamics. So there's a part in the story, and I have that quote down here on the screen, where she says, when it comes to survival, like it's a matter of securing the most basic need, but the question arises, will it be legal to poison, mutilate, or infect people as long as you provide them food, water, and a space to die? And that line, to me, reflects the brutal moral calculus in the novel society, where even the basic sustenance given to the disenfranchised comes with these dehumanizing conditions. And I'm going to talk about those conditions in a couple slides. But in this world, those who don't contribute to the labor of the government are treated as expendable. And the homeless folks, because they are expendable, they are left to be ravaged by climate disaster and neglect. And so even though this question that she poses might seem like an exaggeration, I do think that it brings us face to face with this irony of a world where only by giving up one's community and possibly becoming a source of cheap labor can a person access food, shelter, and basic human dignity when we are in climate crisis. And so it's a grim reminder for me of how in a devastated future, the fight for survival is not just about what you have, but also what you can sell. And sometimes that selling is yourself. And so she, to kind of like give a backdrop for the stuff that's happening in there, like the different things that are affecting the climate, she says that climate in this case is not just a backdrop, it is a character. It's an active agent of destruction. And so she talks about the extreme weather events that are becoming a regular part of life. Tornadoes are smashing the hell out of Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, and 2 or 3 other states. 300 people dead so far, and there's a blizzard freezing in northern Midwest, killing even more people. The chaos of these events becomes the new normal. And so those folks that I talked about in the previous slide, the homeless folks who are walking through all of this, are sometimes like there's parts in the story where a fire just erupts out of nowhere. And because they are not in a space, they have no space that is safe for them to go, a lot of folks end up burning. And so it's one of those things where it's really thinking about the chaos that becomes normality. And yet, even with all the stuff that's happening, people are seeing fires spurt out of nowhere. People are seeing people burn alive. People are seeing all this devastation happening, and there are still people who refuse to accept it. So Lauren ends up, she talks to her friend. She has a friend named Joanne before her community is attacked. And she's telling her friend, like, hey, the climate is changing. This is happening. And Joanne was like, well, my daddy don't think it's changing because he says that only God can change the world in such an important way. And this denial, it is rooted in faith and optimism, but it does allow the United States in the novel to kind of continue grappling ineffectively with the crises. Because they're unwilling to face the reality of a human-induced climate change. So we try to like put it off on religions, like, oh, well, only God can do this. This is not something that we did. So it's something beyond us. We have no control over it. And Lauren is like, no, people have changed this, but they're waiting for it to go back to some old days. Um, they're waiting for things to be great again when we have caused the issues, right? And so she tells her, like, we can't accept this. The reality is that this suffering is happening. The reality is that this is happening to us. And yet, Joanne, her friend's dad, a lot of other folks don't listen to Lauren at all. And so they eventually get caught up in some of the devastation that happens because they refuse to acknowledge that these things are happening around them. And so the last thing that I want to show you, and again, I know I'm kind of just like showing you bits and pieces of it, but I think that they really pinpoint some of the larger ideas that the authors are trying to bring in. And the last kind of thing that I want to bring up that kind of brings the fact of people who are unhoused alongside climate change as this active agent that is devastating and people trying to ignore it is this entering of company towns in the story. And so I feel like at this part, we like arrive at the role of corporate control in a devastated future. And so in the story, there's this company called Kajimoto, Salmon, Frampton and Company. And they purchase entire towns that are devastated by climate change, like the California beach town of Olivar in the story. They refurbish these areas, installing security systems and providing jobs, food, and shelter to the remaining inhabitants. So on the surface, it kind of seems like a lifeline for struggling communities and offering them protection and stability amidst the chaos. But there's this like sinister catch. Those who take refuge in these enclaves are bound by corporate contracts that essentially make them slaves to the system. So these people are trapped in a permanent cycle of labor, guaranteed jobs and housing, but with no real escape or autonomy. They are bound by their dependence on the company, and as a result, they are transformed into captive low wage, like a captive low wage labor force. And so this dystopian future that Butler imagined is one where climate change, rather than being a problem solved through collective action, becomes a tool for deepening economic exploitation and social stratification. And so KSF's control over the town of Olivar is more than just a corporate takeover, it's the commodification of human survival. Those who are most vulnerable, like the unhoused that I mentioned earlier, are forced to trade their freedom and dignity for their lives, trapped in a system that sees them not as citizens, but as assets to be exploited. And so this kind of corporate feudalism exposes a terrifying future where the rights of the individual are secondary to the needs of the corporate machine. And so this reality, it kind of, for me, reflects our current trajectory. Climate change, economic disparity, and social breakdown are already forces that are shaping our world. And Butler's vision is not as far-fetched as it might seem. From the growing wealth gap and the rise of corporate power to the increasing frequency of climate-related disasters, we're already seeing the beginnings of both dystopian futures from Butler's novel and from Smith's. And so when I see these stories, when I see the way that they bring the emotion and the feeling into climate disaster, it makes me see that the climate disaster is no longer a distant possibility. It's here. Despite the warnings that have been issued for decades, we often fail to engage with climate change as an immediate pressing reality. As Strebe observes, climate change is not sexy. It's boring and it's every day. It's easy to imagine climate change as this abstract or futuristic crisis, but in fact, it's unfolding before us in ways that are mundane, ordinary, and often invisible. But the climate crisis doesn't operate in isolation. As I gave examples from the books before, it intersects with and exacerbates pre-existing systems of oppression. And these interconnected structures of inequality shape who suffers the most in a world that's increasingly impacted by climate change. Whether through this displacement, food insecurity, or a lack of access to healthcare, the most vulnerable populations bear the brunt of climate-related harms. And so in this sense, climate change is not this discrete event or phenomenon, it's part of the everyday fabric of oppression that already governs many of our lives. The environmental disaster unfolding around us is not only a crisis of ecology, but it's also a crisis of social justice. Addressing climate change therefore requires more than just environmental action. It demands that we confront the pervasive inequalities that shape how climate impacts are experienced across different communities. So what are we supposed to do? And I think about what the authors suggest. And I love to turn to fiction authors for like, what are we supposed to do with these futures? And I think they give us some good advice. Sherri Smith says that in the text, the main character says, no more every man for himself. If Orleans going to have a better future, we in this together now. And so I feel like she gives us more than a narrative about survival, but she offers us a lesson for facing the world that feels beyond repair. The novel's characters don't just fight to stay alive, they fight for a different kind of world, one built on three key principles of solidarity, resilience in the face of decay, and transformation. So solidarity, it's at the heart of Orleans. It's not every person for themselves. Like I said, it's we in this together now. In the face of overwhelming loss, the community has to come together, recognizing that like we're not going to survive alone. The novel asks us to rethink our individualism and our reliance on systems that have failed us. Smith shows us that true survival depends on how we care for one another and how we build together and how we find our strength in collective action. We aren't just fighting nature or a broken society, we're fighting together alongside nature as a community. The other thing she says is, yes, the Delta was dangerous, but it was very much alive. Ever since the separation, the outer states had been decaying. Back home, riots were common, more common than parades. Protests over food and clean water. Torches were used to firebomb empty storefronts rather than light the night. Yes, there were still schools and grocery stores and amusement parks in the states, buildings without trees growing through their roofs. The outer states had almost everything that Orleans didn't, but the Delta still lived on. And so here what I see is that even as the world crumbles, Orleans teaches us the power of seeing life even when everything seems dead. The Delta, which is what they end up calling this space of Orleans, is torn apart by a bunch of storms, a bunch of hurricanes that come in, and then the disease that follows. And this Delta region is divided a lot, and they feel forsaken, but they're still alive. They're still there. And to me, the lesson is like decay isn't the end. Disaster isn't the end. It's part of a cycle. So even in the ruins, there's the potential for new growth, for something different to emerge. The storms may ravage, but the land doesn't simply die. It adapts, regenerates, continues. And so in the same way, I think that we too can see the potential for life and hope even in our most broken moments. In times of crisis, we have to remind ourselves that life persists even when it seems impossible. And the last piece from the book that I pulled out is she says that nature knows what to do with a poison. She dilutes it. And so this to me was like transformation. Smith's metaphor of nature's response to poison, that it dilutes, it suggests that, I mean, it's a true resilience. It's not about resisting change, but really learning to transform with it. Like we can dilute it, we can change it, we can adapt to it. So just as nature takes something destructive and turns it into something new, we might find ways to adapt and evolve in the face of disaster. So the characters in Orleans, they can't resist the storms. Nature is bigger than all of us. There's no way for us to go out and say, please stop hurricanes, please end tornado. Like we can't do that, but we can learn to navigate them. We can work with the changing world around us. We can work together to stop doing the things that are causing the changes to happen. But I think that transformation, it doesn't mean fixing everything to make it the way it was. It might mean learning how to make a life from what remains. And so I think it's about surviving, but also not, it's not just about surviving the world's decay, but it's about learning to thrive within it and how we learn to ensure that we're not moving towards a further disaster. And I think together, these three quotes that kind of help me think about solidarity and choosing life and transformation, it kind of offers me a meditation on the future that we are at a crossroads and we can choose to isolate ourselves, to ignore the collapse, to pretend we can save ourselves alone, or like the people of Orleans, we can choose solidarity. We can choose to see the life that still exists in the ruins. And most importantly, we can transform ourselves and our society, not in the image of what was, but in response to what is, in an imagination of what it might be. And then I think with Octavia Butler's work, I feel like she gives a lot of lessons because a lot of it is like, here are specific things that I want you to think about. But one of the things that I really wanted to bring in from her is a quote that she made in Essence magazine. I don't know if y'all have ever read Essence magazine, but it's one that my mom used to get. And she says that the one thing that I and my main characters never do when contemplating the future is give up hope. The very act of trying to look ahead, to discern possibilities and offer warnings is in itself an act of hope. And in Butler's universe, in this story, even amidst the ruin, the impulse to imagine, to look forward, and to act is hope, an act of resistance against despair. Hope, as Butler defines it, is not this naive optimism or even the denial of hardship. It's an active, intentional commitment to imagining a future beyond the present crises. And more importantly, it's a commitment to transforming the present to bring a possibly different future into being. And so for Butler's character, hope isn't a passive waiting for change. It's not like we're sitting there like, oh, I wish, I wish, I wish. It's an engagement with the world as it is while actively shaping the world as it could be. And so they're not merely surviving, they're learning to live in balance with the earth in a state of symbiosis, kind of creating these mutual relationships with one another and the planet itself. And so through Parable of the Sower, the earth, just like the different climate disasters like the tornadoes and the hurricanes, also becomes a character in a way. It kind of becomes a teacher, a living partner in the struggle for survival. And I feel like throughout the book, one of the things that she's trying to teach is that nature, though it's brutal sometimes, it's also very wise. And like nature itself, the survivors in Butler's dystopia, they learn to adapt, not by dominating or escaping the environment, but by aligning with its rhythms and embracing the interconnections between both life forms, both the natural life forms and the human life forms. And so I feel like Butler's characters exemplify what it means to thrive in the face of collapse, not by holding on to what was lost, but by becoming mutualists, living in true partnership with each other and the world around us. The characters, they understand that human survival depends on cooperation, not just among humans, but with the non-human world too. And in essence, they embody this radical possibility of thriving through transformation rather than through preservation or a return to a former state. The future they build is not a return to normal, but it's an entirely new way of living. And so it makes me think about, what does this living look like for us? How might we live in mutuality with the earth around us, knowing that we've done some irreversible damage because we've refused to live in mutual alignment? How might we change the way that we're thinking about things so that we can start living in partnership with the earth instead of living for it to work for us? How do we work for each other? And so I think that in the face of climate change and inequality and social decay, Butler's call to me is clear that hope is not a passive dream. It's the active, everyday work of mutual care, survival, transformation. And so I know I talked a little bit about two books in this very short space, but there are so many different climate books out there, and there are so many different conversations about why science fiction is really important for it. But I really like Imogen Malpas's perspective, where she suggests that art and the humanities should play a bigger role in how we think about climate change. Art, in her view, helps us not just to understand the facts, but to feel what it might be like to live through it. Timothy Morton, he talks about climate change as a hyper object, something so massive and overwhelming that it's really hard to fully grasp, and it can make people feel passive or in disbelief. And Malpass is not saying that fiction can solve the issues like rising seas or food shortages or even helping us to get a fuller grasp on it completely, but she is saying that that science fiction or fiction in general is an essential tool to help move us from feeling paralyzed by fear to taking action together. And I think that as we are still dealing with multiple intersecting justice issues, of which climate change is a part of it, I think it's clear that many of our global systems are fragile and inadequate, and we need to face that reality head on. Yeah. And so I think that the voices of the most marginalized, the ones who are often left out of these discussions, should be at the forefront of rebuilding, in the forefront of that conversation. And fiction is a space where marginalized voices have often tried to become part of the conversation when they're often marginalized from the data science, or sometimes from just people listening to the realities that they are facing. And I think that science can give us facts about what's happening, but art, especially art by folks who are marginalized within these systems, it can help us feel it. It can like dig into our bones and help us to imagine the worlds that we want to create and potentially the ones that we don't. And I think that there are tons of books. These are just some of them. I I did a crowdsourcing from friends, but also books that I've read. A lot of them are YA. I know there's probably like more adult ones. I don't read a lot of adult fiction. So I am not the best at giving those recommendations. So that's why I crowdsource some of them. But there are tons of books that might help us feel climate change in a way that facts might not. And I wanted to share several of them here because I think that as I conclude this portion of the conversation, I really want you to think about the different ways, the different stories that have tried to talk about the moment that we are in, whether they are talking about a climate disaster that starts a week from now, or 296 days ago, or something that happens 5 years from now. There are so many stories that people are talking about what's going on. And I think the way that they are talking about it helps to feel it in a way that if I'm reading a scientific article, I may not feel it. But if I am thinking about the emotional arcs of the characters who are going through it, I might be able to feel it in a different way. And so as I conclude today, I want to leave you with one thought that I was thinking tied to the title of the talk today was the benefits of privilege, I don't think will ever trickle down if the water is dried up. And what do I mean by that? In a world where environmental degradation, economic inequality, and social injustice are inextricably linked, we have to recognize that the very systems that allow some of us to flourish, systems of privilege, power, and access, are not sustainable if the earth itself is breaking down. And as I've tried to show in the worlds of both Orleans and Parable of the Sower, those who are the most vulnerable, those without resources, without power, without access, are the first to suffer when crisis strikes. But here's the key, like we're all connected. We are all bound to the same ecological and social systems. And when those systems begin to collapse, they affect us all, even those who believe they are insulated. The waters of privilege, for instance, they may flow uphill for a time, but in a world where the resources and environments that sustain life are running out, those on top will no longer be able to hoard or isolate themselves from the broader crisis. In fact, the very mechanisms that sustain inequality, whether that's through environmental exploitation or social marginalization, will ultimately make us all vulnerable. So it's something that we all must think about in this moment. And so the question that I want to end with is, will we allow the destruction of the earth and the deepening of inequality to continue, knowing it will lead to our shared collapse? Or will we heed the lessons from these speculative worlds and act differently, collectively, compassionately, and with urgency to create a more just, more sustainable future for all of us? And just as I tried to show in the worlds of Butler and Smith, we have to learn to see the world as interconnected, to build solidarity, not just among ourselves, but with the planet. The crisis we face is not out there, not someone else's, it's all of ours. And the choice before us is not whether to act, but how. Thank you.